Hello. Within this section of Module 3, a series of brief video clips are included. They are included to provide an overview of the 2020 policy requirements, identify the areas that have changed from the existing SLD policy, while also pointing out the areas that really aren't all that different from the current policy requirements in the evaluation and identification of SLD. Making connections to existing policy is a good place to start in establishing readiness. With regard to the evaluation of any suspected disability, presented on this slide is the existing North Carolina policy, which is directly derived from the federal regulations. It requires that in the evaluation of students suspected of a special education disability, eligibility must be determined by using multiple sources of data and must not be dependent upon single test scores. Additionally, in the case of considerations for specific learning disability, the evaluation data must include progress monitoring data. This has been the requirement since the reauthorization of the Individuals with Disabilities Education Act in 2004 and the final regulations that were published in 2006. It continues to be the requirement regardless of the model of identification that's being used. So, whether you are using a cognitive discrepancy model of SLD identification or an instructional or RTI-based model of evaluation and identification, the requirement of progress monitoring data has been in place since the reauthorization of the federal law. As public schools in North Carolina prepare for the policy changes, considering the level of fidelity of implementation of existing policy as intended could be a first step while thinking through some guiding questions around whether the education professionals and those directly involved in special education decision-making fully understand and adhere to the existing policy requirements for evaluation as those policies were written and intended to be executed. As you can see from this snapshot of what's drawn from the federal regulations and translates into our North Carolina policy, specific to evaluation, there's a foundation from which to establish readiness for the 2020 changes. In your system, first determine whether lack of consistent application of our existing policy requirements is a factor that might be limiting readiness for some of the changes that will come with the SLD policy addendum. In the previous section of this module, you've learned about how the North Carolina Department of Public Instruction Exceptional Children's Division updated the definition of a specific learning disability and situated it within the context of existing research. Characteristics of students with specific learning disabilities have been presented in order to provide a general understanding of who these students are that we are considering and needing to determine effective instruction and appropriate identification. So we'll move into identifying the critical components throughout these short video clips. Those critical components or criteria for establishing specific learning disabilities based in the 2020 policy addendum. On this slide, you see the 5 criteria that must be met in order to sufficiently establish a learning disability. Now, this is the 2020 policy. We will begin by ensuring that we're addressing through multiple sources of data, ruling out lack of appropriate instruction and limited English proficiency. So we start with criterion 1, because in order to determine a within child struggle, we must first ensure that the child has had access to quality instruction, and intervention. Criterion 2 addresses the exclusionary factors that need to be ruled out as primary factors in the student's learning struggles, while criterion 3 and 4 specifically address inadequate achievement in comparison to age or grade level standards and insufficient progress by either demonstrating lack of progress or progress that is at a rate that's considered insufficient to reduce the risk of failure over time. Criterion 5 exists for all students suspected and considered under IDEA eligibility. This criterion requires evidence to support that as a result of the disability identified, there is an adverse effect on educational performance, which could mean academic and or functional performance, and a need has been established for specially designed instruction and the resources that are available through special education. This was intended to provide you a general overview of connections made within our existing policy as we begin to walk through the 5 criteria that are required based in the 2020 policy addendum. We will continue throughout this section of the module, identifying through each of the criterion and making connections with existing policy and also pointing out what has changed with the policy addendum.